economist par excellence, and then hear him in conversation with an equally influential voice. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, his economic surveys have reset the benchmark on macroeconomy assessment. From a clunky pre-budget document, his economic survey is tracked for its incisive insights into India's economic and social indicators. It clearly takes one rock star economist to match wits with another. So please welcome on stage India's Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, for a one-of-its-kind conversation with Professor Nouriel Roubini. The world, ladies and gentlemen, in 2018. And please do remember to tweet using the hashtag IEC 2018. Gentlemen, all yours.
Good morning, everyone. Firstly, happy birthday, Nouriel. I want to say that that was really a masterful summary of short-term, long-term, all the challenges and the kind of tailwinds as well. For those of you who don't know Nouriel, he's referred to as Dr. Doom. I think what was, for me, really quite amazing about what he did, not just kind of anticipate the global financial crisis, one of the few who did, but also actually spelt out how it might happen in a way that few economists didn't. So Nouriel, a great job on that. It's wonderful to be in this role. Probably for the first time, I'm not being asked questions, and I get to ask the questions. So it's wonderful to be here. So let me begin, Nouriel. I want to also kind of relate it to how these things affect India as well. So let me pin you down with, I think, three possible risks for the global economy and therefore for India. So first, if you look at, you mentioned in the short run, the risks of trade war have kind of escalated, right? There's still skirmishes, but they're... The interesting thing for me is that, as we were discussing earlier, President Trump's actions on steel, elicited a lot of negative reactions all over the world, especially because it was aimed at allies. But the action against China has much broader support than even the globalists. Even the globalists concede that China has to kind of behave a little bit better on some of these issues. So if actually the actions against China are credible, especially because we have a president who kind of intends to go through with them, how do you then assess the risks of this escalating?
Well, what I would say is that you're making a correct point that while China has been speaking as if they're the champion of free trade and globalization, a number of the trade and investment practices of China have been actually quite protectionist. And I think that both US firms, European, Japanese, and also in emerging markets have expressed concern about the long list of things: intellectual property rights, market access, some of the non-tariff barriers, the system of essentially transferring of technology or forcing licensing agreements, reverse engineering and stealing and so on. So I think that on these issues, the US president has a series of valid points, and he has quite support also among Democrats and Republicans, and it's legitimate to address those questions. I would say that my concerns are twofold, however. One is that these are concerns not just for the US, but also for many other countries in the world, and would have rather preferred a multilateral approach rather than a bilateral. If the US is able to open up the Chinese market for its firms and all its firms, that's trade diversion. If the US tells China, buy more semiconductor from us, and implies that China buys less semiconductors from Korea, Thailand, or Japan, that's a trade diversion. So I prefer a multilateral approach rather than a bilateral one. And there is also the concern that the positive spin is that you're forcing China to address things that they didn't want to address before. The risk is that if you really play hardball on China, and you've been playing hardball unilaterally on aluminum, on steel, on solar panels, on a wide range of other things, on NAFTA, on free trade agreements, and so on, that eventually this could escalate in something of a trade war. We're not yet in a trade war, we're a trade skirmish, but there could be an escalation. So you could see it as a positive way of prying open China and open their markets, but you could also see it as a risk.
Right. So for the moment, we should kind of watch, but it's still not too serious. The next risk I want to talk about, because it's something that actually you're really an expert on, which you touched upon at the end, and sticking to China for a second. You know, all of us, you and many others have said that if there's one indicator of potential kind of crises or a crisis where the amber lights really flash very brightly, is the buildup in credit in any system. The buildup in credit in China has been just phenomenal. It's not just the level, but the pace at which this has happened. Now it's something like a non-financial sector credit, 170% of GDP, and an increase of about 100 percentage points over a very short time. I mean, you normally would say, watch out, watch out, watch out. But is there something about China that's different that either delays this or actually makes it less likely that it will happen at all, and somehow China will kind of avoid what many emerging market countries have not been able to with this kind of credit binge?
I would say that there are some characteristics of China that might delay the onset of a banking or a financial crisis, because in a typical, say, Asian financial crisis or other emerging markets where you have a build-up of domestic and external debt that eventually leads to a currency or a banking or a balance of payment crisis, you had that a lot of this debt was external rather than domestic. The country was running a current account deficit. The country had an overvalued currency. The country was not having a lot of foreign assets. While if you look at China, they run a current account surplus. They have a large amount of foreign assets. Their currency is not overvalued. Of course, they also have capital controls. And they have policy tools to manage this transition. But for the last decade, effectively, China has been kicking the can down the road. And every time there is a slowdown of growth, new round of credit fuel fixed investment. And given these fundamental strengths, has been able to postpone the moment of reckoning. But I was recently in Beijing, and I think all the technocrats are now in position of power. And good news is that President Xi Jinping has chosen for the central bank, for the banks, an insurance regulator, for the finance minister, for his key economic advisors, and others, people who are between technocratic to reformer. The Chinese realize that at this point, they've postponed the problem, but they have to address it. And either they address it by rebalancing growth towards consumption away from investment, consumption of services, reducing overcapacity, reducing this over-leverage, cleaning up the banking system, the shadow banking system, or eventually stresses could occur. Yep. So they've just delayed the problem. It's not as if they've resolved it. So they have the time and they have the resources and the policies to address it. But I think the next 2 years are going to be actually critical to see that some of the reforms that were needed before were not done for political reasons. She was trying to establish his power, was concerned about corruption and other things. Now there's the time to do the economic reforms.
Yeah, so actually, Nouriel, I want to put you on the spot a little bit and rephrase the question. I mean, just as you did for the global financial crisis, talk us through how, if a crisis might occur in China, what would be the trigger, what would be the vulnerabilities, and how this might get out of hand, taking into account all that you said, all that's unusual about China, current account surplus, not no value exchange rate, huge reserves, but spell out a scenario for us where actually you see something like a mini crisis or even a bigger crisis happening in China. What would the mechanism be?
Well, you know, we already have seen the potential for it in the last 2 years, because 2 of the last risk episodes in the global economy, August, September of 2015 and January, February of 2016 were triggered by concerns about the hard landing of China. In both episodes, you had a massive correction of Chinese equity prices, over 30%. There were massive pressure on the currency, and that pressure on the currency led to a massive fall in reserves from 4 trillion to 3 trillion. They lost almost $1 trillion of reserves in spite of running current account surplus. And then they had to really reimpose massive capital controls. They had to reassure that nobody's going to go bankrupt, because otherwise there will be a run against weak financial institutions. They postponed the restructuring of local government and state-owned enterprises. So there were financial stresses, and there were the chances of actually a real banking and balance of payment crisis. And they postponed the problem by doing some reforms, but also imposing capital controls and stabilizing the currency. But my point is, at this point, given the amount of the debt and the speed of the rise of it, given that you have zombie banks, zombie shadow banks, zombie state-owned enterprises, local government, property, and also some parts of the corporate sector, either you address these problems, or if you're going to build more debt on top of bad debt, eventually there'll be something that's going to go wrong. And whether the trigger of it is going to be the real estate sector as opposed to another crash of the stock market or another pressure on the currency, the trigger points can be different ones or a combination, all of them together. And I think that the good news is that the senior policymaker of China realizes these are risks. Risks can be addressed, and they have to do something about them. But they also realize they cannot kick the can down the road for another 5 years.
Right. Now, I want to come back to the counterpart of this in India, which is the whole financial sector and what lessons you might have for that. But there's one kind of risk or factor, probably the only one, Nouriel, which you didn't mention, which is of course of great concern and interest to India, is oil prices. If you think about India, almost all our vulnerabilities, in some sense, have been triggered, macro vulnerabilities have been triggered by rises in oil prices. Whether it was, even in 2013, I think the oil price played a big part, in 1990, 1980. So for us, the oil price is, so in the last 2 years, or rather not in the last 2 years, when oil had come down from 147 down, we thought it was really a big opportunity for us, and it did actually improve our macro situation tremendously. And I personally also thought that given shale and given the way Chinese demand growth had slowed down, that we were in for a permanent kind of situation where oil prices would really not sustainably go above 55, maybe 60 even. But now, in the last few months, we've seen oil stay and even reach 70, 71 for considerable period of time. So do you think that the old hypothesis that kind of oil price had been capped by shale, that holds, or should we actually revise those views and actually allow for possibly durably higher oil prices going forward?
Well, my view is there are some temporary factors that have pushed oil prices above maybe their medium long-term fundamental value. Some of it is this cyclical global expansion that leads to more demand for oil, and there have been also some concerns that political risk in a variety of countries might limit the supply of oil. There may be oil shocks in Venezuela, in Nigeria, and Libya, and I hope there is not a confrontation between US and Iran on the nuclear issue, but that could be a major risk, could lead to a shock to oil prices. And as you point out, an economy like India that is oil dependent, a rise in oil prices create problems. It might lead to a rise in headline and core inflation. It worsens the trade balance. It worsens the fiscal balance. It might force the central bank to tighten more rather than ease more. And while I'm optimistic about the economic outlook of India, say this year in the future, if there is certainly one risk that could lead to some slowdown of growth being closer to 7 than 7.5, if not lower, will be a rise in oil prices. So in the short run, I think that oil prices could go higher, especially if some of those supply risk materialize. However, medium long term, I think that the story that oil is going to be lower for longer, I think is true for at least a couple of reasons. First one is the shale gas and oil revolution. Today's in the US, but there are massive reserves of shale gas and oil in many other parts of the world. And these shale and gas oil producers have become actually more productive right now. Their break-evens are closer now to $50 a barrel. So as soon as oil prices are above 50, with a delay of a few months, they can essentially put more rigs and pump more shale gas and oil out of the ground. And the supply response is very fast for shale. It's not like major oil projects where you have to invest $10 billion for 10 years before you see a drop of oil like major traditional. The other thing I think is there is a revolution is coming from renewable energy. Today, the cost of wind power, the cost of solar power and other form of green energy are falling rapidly, and they're going to fall even more so. Solar power in many parts of the world now is cheaper than coal, and therefore coal is going to be something of the future. So you can have cheaper energy and clean energy at the same time, and the other revolution is going to be not only that we're going to have a fall in this price of renewable energy, but now with rechargeable batteries and this technology becoming more efficient, we'll be able to store solar power, not just use it in peak time. So if you look medium, long term, I think these two trends imply that actually the price of energy should be falling gradually, but this is a horizon of the next 5 to 20 years. Is not what can happen in the next 12 months where short-term factor can keep oil prices higher than otherwise.
So we need to be watchful over the short term, but fundamentally we're in a kind of low energy price world.
Yeah.
The other, I think, question which I've been wanting to pose to you is, if you look at stock price valuations in India and internationally, I mean, would you characterize this as, new normal, irrational exuberance, should be watchful? Just let me make that question a bit more pointed. I think there's one difference between what's happening to stock prices in India and internationally. There are lots of differences, but one critical difference is that you have these equity valuations in advanced economies along with very high bond valuations as well. This, because interest rates are so low, and so you have, in a sense, two kind of possible quote-unquote bubbles. But in India, interest rates, real interest rates are not that low. They're still, reasonably, take your pick, it's something like 2.5%, maybe more, depending on how you measure it. So equity valuations, price earnings ratios are not dissimilar, but under these very different conditions where, you have a potential bond market bubble, or at least potentially one in India. So how should we evaluate, whether our valuations are frothy, normal, especially in an international comparison?
Well, the way I would think of it is that if you're looking for advanced economies as opposed to India, as you pointed out, having near zero policy rates and having long-term interest rates until recently very low implied that, of course, money was going to risky assets, and some of these high P ratios, whether in US or other advanced economies, are explained by low interest rates. Now, in India, as you point out, bond yields are much higher. However, there is a global factor, because when valuations are high in US and interests are low, money is searching for yield and is going where valuations are lower, and there's been a flood of money, especially when risk is on as opposed to off, that has gone to emerging market economies, including India. So there's global factor indirectly can affect valuation of India. And as you know, inflows of equity capital into India are less restricted than inflows into the bond market as well. So that's how global factors can affect India, even if bond yields are higher in India. In the case of India, I would say that what explains these valuations, they look like high. They could be justified by fundamental if after a period of time where growth was slower, as we know, demonetization, the introduction of the GST that were actually important economic reform, the way they were introduced implied a slowdown of growth in the short run. If a pickup of growth above 7% is going to occur, and if additional reform are going to occur, and if potential growth is going to go towards 8%, this valuation might be slightly high, but they could be justified by improved economic growth, earnings of the corporate sector, and you name it. But if instead the growth were to surprise on the downside, either because reform don't occur or because the macro policy outlook is not so strong, or if there are global shock like oil prices rising, of course, a correction could occur as well. So it's, I wouldn't call it, of course, a bubble, but whether a correction can occur depends on what's going to be the short-term and the longer-term fundamental of growth of India.
Yeah, but it's good that one of the things you point out is that there is a kind of co-movement between equity prices internationally. So, you know, part of it will be determined by our growth prospects and you know, the return of you know, corporate profits, but some of it will also be determined by international factors. So if, for example, you know, the Fed raises interest rates, say 4 times instead of 3, there could be a correction in valuations in, you know, in the US, which could then come back here as well. So we should kind of watch that a bit carefully as well. That's one of the things you're...
Yeah, the Fed matters, and of course in periods where there is risk off and there is global risk aversion rising, that affects advanced economies, that actually affects emerging market more strongly. And on the trade side, I would say that while India is a less open economy, say, than China, than other emerging markets, one is becoming more open, and therefore trade is going to matter more for India. And there are ways in which protectionism in the world can negatively affect India. For example, you know, the US might impose restrictions to H-1B visas or to the ability of, you know, firms that are in the information technology in India to provide IT services to the United States if US becomes more protectionist. So in your own comparative advantage in IT resources, protectionism by US will be a negative even for India.
So we need to wrap up. Let me just ask one, maybe 2 very, very quick questions. First question, what would your advice be to India on how we should address our banking challenges, given what you've, you know, learned internationally?
Well, you know, first of all, you have to clean up your banking system. Those banks that are undercapitalized will have to recapitalize. The bad assets and NPLs will have to be essentially dealt with either by provisioning or eventually, like other countries have done, there are models of forming asset management company where these assets are taken out and essentially managed separately. You have to change the governance of your banking system as a way of making sure that the kind of practices occurred in the past are not occurring.
And just do you think these governance changes also require changes in the ownership structure? Should we be thinking about less majority public sector? I mean, do you think governance can be changed without you know, ownership changes?
Oh, well, there are 2 views. One says that eventually the way to improve governance is to reduce the direct state role in the banking system and gradually, essentially, privatize them. The other one is a model that says if you give the right incentive to the bank managers, if you stop policies in which the banks have to provide credit to favored sectors of the economy or firms and so on, you change the incentive in the world of the manager, and they can behave effectively like private sector firms. So you can do one model or the other ones. And of course, changes also, as was pointed out in corporate law, especially bankruptcy, imply that then in situations in which there are folks that are doing opportunistic defaults, being able to seize the assets are going to also improve the situation for the banking system as well.
Great. I think on that note, we should end. One last word.
To ask you your views about what will be the additional economic reform that the government is going to be making in the next few years. Because there are elections next year, but there is an important agenda of more to be done.
Do we actually have time for that question? Okay, so I think that, you know, Nouriel, firstly, you know, we've kind of encountered, you know, the way we said this in the survey was that, you know, clearly after we've put behind some of the major structural reform, the short-term consequences of that. Growth has certainly started to revive, and it's pretty, broad-based. So growth has picked up. But then, our macroeconomic challenges, some of them have resurfaced because inflation went up. Our fiscal deficit, we had to recalibrate and so on. But I think that in some ways, I think there are 2 or 3 big reform actions that don't necessarily involve new stuff that we have to do. Look, my own view is that if we, stabilize the GST implementation, which we're, heading towards, if we, yesterday we had some fantastic news. Air India is now out for bidding, the privatization of Air India, if we can conclude that. And then, of course, I think the big elephant in the room is still, the banking sector challenge. Now, we had done fired 2 big bazookas, as it were. Resolution under the bankruptcy process was really proceeding, it's still proceeding. And then, of course, we recapitalized the banks. But I think recent events have kind of forced us, or is going to force us to kind of reevaluate whether we need to do more on these things as well. So I think there is a big agenda ahead, which involves just finishing, all the things that we've started. And then perhaps, we continue the, the technology-based delivery of public services, the more long-run issues. All those I think are there, but I think there is a big enough agenda that, I think if we can solve this twin balance sheet challenge, given the new developments that have happened, I think that itself can, and given that we've put the short-term consequences of the GST and demonetization behind us, I think that could itself propel us to higher rates of growth than we've seen recently.
How about labor market or land reform maybe after the election? Is there going to be something on the agenda, or it's politically difficult?
I think that those are things that we will have to see going forward. I think let me just see that on labor market reform. I think it's fair to say that it's something that doesn't have to be done by the central government alone. It's something that some state governments started, but we need more and more state governments to follow. So that's an area, like many others, where I think one should not just look at the central government for reforms, but also we have this phrase called competitive federalism. I think it's a very powerful dynamic in India, and I think I would also hope to rely on that going forward as much as whatever the central government will do.
Well, 2 fantastic minds talking about economy, the world, politics and policy. They can go on and on, but we have paucity of time. Arvind Subramanian and Nouriel Roubini, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Happy birthday, Nouriel, once again.
Happy birthday from all of us.
Yes, and you share your birthday with the Minister for Agriculture from Gabon, Biendi Maganga. There you go. Happy birthday, Biendi. Big round of applause for the 2 gentlemen, please. They've been fantastic.